Okay, welcome everyone to our annual, to our Crease Noon Lecture Series. My name is Christina Fairbright. I'm the director of the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies. And it's my pleasure today to introduce to you our speaker, who is part of our, one of the theme series we're doing this semester is called Buying and Selling States and Markets. And so in addition to the other lectures we're doing, other programming, we did try to get a handful of people together who are going to be speaking to this theme. Virag is one of them, and the idea is to look at the role of economic life, both in the socialist period and in the period since. Everything from looking at state socialist economists and the way their theories might dovetail or not with Western economists to the kind of thing we're going to hear about today from Professor Molnar about how nationalism itself might be promoted through the market. Dr. Virag Molnar is associate professor at the New School of Social Research in New York, and she got her PhD in sociology from Princeton. She got her BA in economics from the Budapest School of Economics. And I want to throw in, she was also spent a year in New Mexico, 2 years in New Mexico, which is my home state, so we have another connection there, at the United World College, the Armand Hammer International Baccalaureate School. So she has quite a range of experience. Virag's book, Building the State, Architecture, Politics, and State Formation in Post-Socialist Central Europe, came out in 2013. It's a very different kind of project from this one, looking at architects, at the whole profession going into the industry of making especially panel concrete architecture in Eastern Europe. So that's a very special book. But without further ado, please welcome Dr. Virag Molnar.
I will need to use the mic so that you can hear me. And let me find my presentation as well. I think I can just open it.
So do you want to do this?
So let's go to the beginning. Yeah. So I'm really grateful to Christy for inviting me. I haven't been to Ann Arbor in 10 years, so it's really nice to be back. And I have to say that the weather is also not quite what expected in November in Michigan, so that's another pleasant surprise. And I'm really happy to be here and share this relatively new research, so I'm really looking forward to comments and suggestions on how to improve it. So I think scholarship on post-socialist nationalism has focused overwhelmingly on the dramatic post-1989 surge of ethnic nationalism that escalated into violent struggles of self-determination and civil wars in the Balkans and across former Soviet republics in Central Asia. Less attention has been paid to other more mundane and less violent forms of post-socialist nationalism that emerged after the fall of socialism and can be characterized by strong symbolic and performative elements. In this presentation, I try to suggest that these new articulations of symbolic nationalism warrant closer attention because they have significantly contributed to the rise of new forms of radical nationalism across Central and Eastern Europe, especially in countries such as Russia or Hungary. Also, a relatively new development in the post-socialist context is the rapid commodification of radical nationalist sentiments and the parallel emergence of a vigorous cultural industry that supplies a multitude of props for the expression and enactment of radical nationalist sentiments. The creation of cultural niche economies that carry political significance by reworking the symbolic lexicon and material culture of national and ethnic identification is, I think, an overlooked aspect of the market transition in post-socialist countries. This is why the following analysis explores the intersections between markets and new forms of nationalism in contemporary Hungary by looking at the manufacturing, sale, and consumption of radical nationalist commodities and services. It argues that the increasing right-wing radicalization of Hungarian politics and the growth of uncivil publics have been fueled by an expanding industry that effectively turns these sentiments into commercial products. So the larger research project focuses on 4 key areas of radical nationalist culture production: book publishers that explicitly specialize, and I think I have this list here, that specialize in printing and disseminating nationalist literature. Second, heritage tourism to neighboring countries, especially to Transylvania, Romania, that aims to build bridges to diaspora Hungarians. Third is so-called national rock bands that have codified a new economically successful genre of political popular music. These bands are actually chief agents of updating historical motives and narratives of mythic nationalism to fit contemporary social and political circumstances. And finally, clothing brands that market explicitly nationalist fashion items and have built extensive online distribution networks that also provide a platform for marketing other popular nationalist culture products. And obviously, I won't have time to talk about each of these 4 cases today, so I'll be focusing on book publishing and clothing brands. So by tracing the symbolic economies of new forms of radical nationalism, I try to highlight an important dimension of everyday or banal nationalism. This analytical lens helps to demonstrate that contemporary right-wing radicalism is not a codified political ideology, but a more fluid subculture in which expressive symbols, material objects, rituals, everyday consumption, and lifestyle patterns are essential carriers of political convictions and markers of group boundaries. These symbolic economies also contribute to reconfiguring the boundaries between politics and the public sphere, allowing radical nationalist discourse to penetrate mainstream political discourse. And what I try to do, like theoretically, is really to situate this research in a very sprawling interdisciplinary literature on economic nationalism. And I'm only going to give a snapshot of the theoretical framework because I'd like to spend the time more on talking about the case studies, which I think are very interesting. But just to give you a short summary of some of this literature, that's really, it kind of includes very disparate strands of literature going from international political economy, the political economy of ethnic nationalism, to the sociological study of ethnic enclaves, all the way to anthropological studies of nation branding and ethnopreneurs. Right, so I'm trying to bring these very different literatures into conversation, but I also argue that kind of the commodification, commercialization of radical nationalism in Hungary and in Central Europe doesn't really fit any of these categories in the literature. So I'm also trying to think about some new conceptual tools that can help to incorporate this type of commodification of nationalism. So I'm really interested in this intersection between markets and nationalism. And I think, there is this long literature, I think probably most dominant in international political economy on economic nationalism. This thinking goes all the way back to the late 19th century, to the work of Friedrich List, a German economic historian. And at the time, it included a set of policy measures like protectionism, autarky, import tariffs, and so on. And it was very prominent and dominant in interwar Europe. But interesting, there is a kind of revival of this thinking of economic nationalism in the context of globalization today. So now it's no longer really kind of linked to a very specific set of economic policy measures, but there is more of a thinking about, what is economic, what is the content of economic nationalism, and how can be paired with certain policy measures and policy thinking in the context of neoliberalization and globalization. And although, this seems like very far from what I'm doing here, is because I'm interested in how symbolic commodities are used for the expression of certain group identities. But actually, if we see this shift in the economic nationalism literature, even in the political economy one, what we can see is that it's increasingly about the protection of local cultures and national cultures, right? So if, again, we think about the European Union, some of the most prominent measures that they have taken, one has to do with the banning of GMOs, for instance. And here again, food security is directly linked to national security, right? And then in addition to that, we have this very elaborate system of geographic indicators. There is this licensing system in which local producers get exclusive usage of certain product names. I'm sure you're all familiar with this, like prosciutto di Parma or Scotch whiskey, of course, Hungarian brandy. So only certain local producers have the right to use these names, right? And the products are kind of the production process is certified. So here again, we have a form of economic nationalism that is really about, not just about the protection of local producers, but about the protection of national cultures that might be undermined by neoliberal free trade, right? And this already brings us to food. And food nationalism, I think, has always been a very prominent thing. Often I think nations are imagined and consumed in culinary terms, right? So either we associate particular aspects of our cuisine with our national identity, or we engage in rituals that kind of include and involve food consumption, right? And the US is no exception here. If we think about Coke, it's really kind of one of what Roland Barthes would call a totem drink, right? But also there is very interesting research by a sociologist, Kristen Surak, just published a book a couple of years ago about the Japanese tea ceremony and how it's linked to national identity. But also, moreover, that there is a very elaborate set of corporate interests that are invested in maintaining the Japanese tea ceremony as it is, right? Again, there is a very complicated kind of certification licensing system there, the Yamato system. So this is also a huge business, right? It's this very interesting relationship between national identity and kind of economic production. And in the post-socialist context, there is exciting work by Melissa Caldwell, the anthropologist on Russia, and how food nationalism is becoming a very important aspect of Russian national identity. So, for instance, producers make very sharp distinctions between food that is ours and food that is not ours. And just a couple of weeks ago, there was a really interesting clip in the New York Times, a video clip that showed the restaurant scene in Moscow, and especially how it is affected by economic sanctions, right? So now they have to substitute. They can no longer import things like mozzarella from Italy. So they have to substitute everything from local producers. But now this is becoming kind of a source of national pride, because now they can say, we can make mozzarella that's just as good as Italian mozzarella, or the same with cured ham, right? So now this is becoming kind of a source of national pride in Russia as well, and this is how they respond to the sanctions there. And finally, there is another brand of scholarship that looks at mainly the intersections between, I think, ethnicity and markets. And of course, there's this huge literature on ethnic enclaves. The study of ethnic enclaves in the US was really integral even to the rise of the field of economic sociology. And of course, it looks at more kind of these ethnic niche economies from the labor market aspect and how this is an important tool of immigrant incorporation in the US. But at the same time, of course, these ethnic niche economies also produce a sustained demand for the type of products and services that are consumed by the employers, right? And then we also see a kind of second-order commodification in the forms of like Chinatowns or Koreatowns that become attractive to local outsiders and tourists as well, and kind of this ethnic identity then gets commodified. And of course, this twist is what's explored by Jean and John Komarov in their book on ethnicity incorporation, when we're looking at how the politics of ethnicity is catapulted into the market. So, these are some of the literatures that I'm looking at, but I'm kind of arguing that radical nationalism, as we see it in Hungary, doesn't really fit any of these categories, because it's not really an example of nation branding, right? Here you're not branding kind of Hungarian national identity and ethnicity to outsiders, to like tourists or European EU bureaucrats, but you're really kind of branding it to other Hungarians. And it's both kind of inclusionary and exclusionary, because it includes diaspora Hungarians who live beyond the borders of Hungary, but it's exclusionary because it ethnicizes Hungarian national identity, and it excludes ethnic minorities like Jews or the Roma. So I'm building more on like theories from subcultural literature and the work of Viviana Zelizer in terms of looking at circuits of commerce. But I think that's probably enough about kind of the theoretical framework here. This is how I'm trying to link my very specific case of Hungary, to some of the larger conversations about the commodification of national and ethnic identities. But let me move on to, some of the case studies here. And I wanted to start with book publishing and bookstores. So there is this genre called like the national bookstores and national book publishers in Hungary, and they provide one of the most important commercial circuits for the dissemination of radical nationalist print culture. And it would be a mistake to imagine these bookstores as kind of stuffy, low-end, hole-in-the-wall establishments tucked away in remote corners of Budapest and other Hungarian cities, peddling kind of samizdat-style radical literature. On the contrary, they tend to be highly visible, airy retail stores located in the middle and upper middle-class neighborhoods of the capital and on the main streets of large urban centers in the Hungarian countryside. So one of them, a bookstore called Anima, which is part of a Budapest-wide chain, can be found in Mon Park, an upscale boutique shopping mall situated in the commercial heart of the well-to-do 12th district in the Buda side of the city. The district is a dominantly residential neighborhood with some of the city's most expensive real estate. The mall houses high-end global fashion labels like Michael Kors or the Italian Stefano, classy restaurants and bars, a multiplex cinema, and Budapest's most expensive butcher shop that supplies the city's Michelin star chefs with top-quality meat cuts. The store window already gives away the political leanings of the literature on offer. Next to the latest popular cookbooks and picturesque coffee table books on horses and wildlife, there is a large magazine stand that display historical magazines, and this is what you can see on the picture here. The lineup is clearly dominated by radical nationalist publications, most obviously the magazines entitled Trianon and Greater Hungary, but also Dobogo, Hungarian Mythic History, Hungarian Chronicles. So some of these are less immediately identifiable as radical periodicals just based on their titles. But I also wanted to point out that you can see Thomas Piketty's capital there. And again, there is an elective affinity here because anti-capitalist critique is a very strong aspect of this type of radical nationalism that I'm talking about, right? So there are some strange alliances here.
This is the capital in Hungary. This word means the capital. I don't speak it.
Yeah. This is the book. This is the Hungarian translation of Piketty's capital, right? So even as I idly browsed the travel section of the store, I unexpectedly encountered some provocative material. So the seemingly ordinary road atlas for Hungary I stumble upon turns out to be a political exercise in symbolic cartography. The atlas is entitled Hungarian Habitat Road Atlas, where the Hungarian term used for habitat is a clear allusion to the German Lebensraum concept that was appropriated by Nazi ideologues in interwar Germany to justify their expansionist drive into Eastern Europe. In the case of the atlas, the use of the term is telling because the atlas covers the geographical territory of Hungary before the Treaty of Trianon in 1920. In which Hungary lost 2/3 of its pre-World War I territory to neighboring countries like Romania, right? So this map includes like big chunks of other countries like Romania and Slovakia. Thus, the atlas is used to symbolically rewrite and restore the historical boundaries of the Hungarian nation. The authors expressly formulate this intent in the preface of the atlas, entitled Road to the Future. So at first glance, this publication of the Hungarian habitat looks like any other professional road atlas. I'm quoting from the preface here. The area encompassed by the map is divided into numbered squares, and the individual plates on the pages display a detailed view of roads of various types, settlements of various sizes, but here everything is in Hungarian. So this is an unprecedentedly precise, boldly sincere, witty, and incidentally useful road atlas that builds on the knowledge of the past and serves the needs of the present, while pointing to a hopefully happier and more just future, to a future in which things, objects, and places regain their real names. It is not a nostalgia map, but a map of a living past, a kind of intellectual and spiritual conquest, right? And let me just add like a footnote here in terms of the usefulness of the atlas. Well, actually, like practically, it's totally useless because when you're driving in Romania and all the signs are in Romanian, and you're trying to do that in a Hungarian map, it's very, very difficult, right? So even though this is kind of marketed as a utilitarian product, it's totally valueless in that sense, right? So Hungarian memorial sites are also meticulously marked in the atlas, including those that were destroyed by the occupiers. And according to the publisher, over 30,000 copies of the atlas have been sold over the past 4 years, and an updated edition came out in 2014. So in addition to specific products that turn mundane objects like a road atlas into a nationalist and irredentist political statement, there are entire genre categories that are characteristic of national bookstores. The most common categories that organize the offerings include a vast sea of literature on the national trauma of the Treaty of Trianon, on Transylvania, the Holy Crown of St. Stephen, on runic script, or Arvishura, which is a modern reconstruction of the mythic origins of Hungarians rooted in shamanistic spiritualism. And it was actually recorded by a steelworker from a northern Hungarian city over 3 decades. His writings were discovered in the late 1990s and have generated a large following since the turn of the millennium. But also works on Hungarian prehistory, which refers to the history of the origin of the Hungarian people, their roots in Central Asia, their migration trajectory in the era of the 9th century, the conquest of the Carpathian Basin, and these make up another important category. Literature that investigates diverse, more and less speculative theories about Hungarians' links to various real and mythic people, such as Finno-Ugric, Han, Scythian, Sumerian, you name it, as well as theories that present evidence that even Jesus was actually Hungarian, also feature prominently among the offerings. In similar way, there seems to be an elective affinity between radical nationalism and the variant of New Age spiritualism, as esoteric literature takes up an entire section in these stores and includes recent work that blends esotericism with more traditional Hungarian origin myths. The bookstores typically also has a large collection of fiction and non-fiction literature that deals with and or is written by diaspora Hungarians from neighboring countries or in the US. And you just see like a couple of examples here. Again, like this whole issue with runic script is very important for this subculture. Right? And kind of the pricing of these books ranges from a few dollars to $40. The average is between 10 and 15. So purchasing these books is not a trivial expense for ordinary Hungarians whose expenditures on books had sharply declined in the post-socialist period. And customers are likely to come from, so this is an indicator that customers are likely to come from like lower middle class milieu. So there are lots of independent bookstores that specialize in this type of radical nationalist literature, but there are also 2 important chains of bookstores. One is called Skytia, and it's a nationwide chain, and the previously mentioned Anima is another chain with 6 stores operated in Budapest. And kind of in the paper version of this article and project, I look more into the story of the bookstores as well, and some of them have very close link to the US because they're the longest, the one with the longest history, actually operated in New York on 2nd Avenue from the 1970s to the early 1990s. But let me move on to the clothing brands. So of course the close association between some fashion labels and far-right extremist groups has been widely discussed in the media and scrutinized by some academic researchers. For a long time, members of far-right extremist groups across Europe favored brands like Lonsdale and Fred Perry or even New Balance, but following a considerable brand backlash and the de facto banning of some of the garments, the brandscape of the far-right has been undergoing a major transformation since the early 2000s. So currently the German Torsteiner is probably the best known and certainly the economically most successful neo-Nazi-friendly clothing brand on the market. So as the sociologist Cynthia Miller-Idris noted, Torsteiner was the first to commercialize far-right identity. It took it from something that would be homemade in someone's garage to a really expensive, high-quality clothing brand. So at a glance, Torsteiner, I think, resembles this like waspy American pseudo-collegiate brands like Abercrombie and Fitch, Hollister, or Aeropostale, while displaying a distinctly Nordic aesthetics. A closer look, however, reveals a calculated use of subtle references to Nazi iconography. So the brand's logo, for instance, that you can see up here. Right, so it's this upward pointing arrow with a zigzag and 2 small dots, and it alludes to 2 illegal Nazi symbols and was actually banned in Germany by a German court in 2004, but the company won a legal suit that reversed the ban in 2008. At present, Torsteiner operates 47 stores in 9 countries, with most branches in Russia and in Germany. The brand was founded in 1999, and by 2007, they were making 2 million euros in annual revenue. In recent years, however, it has begun to lose ground due to stiff competition from similar brands like Oscar Arion or Eric & Sons that employ more overtly political and directly neo-Nazi symbolism. These international brands are available in Hungary primarily through online stores and a handful of local distributors. But I think it's interesting to note that Torsteiner has no local branch in Hungary, whereas it maintains 3 stores in the neighboring Czech Republic and 5 stores in Slovakia. And this is partly because radical nationalist clothing brands in Hungary tend to be more different than similar to their Western European counterparts. And I basically focused on 3 brands here. This one called Warrior, and then 2 other ones because I think they kind of represent the 3 most prevailing trends, the kind of the militant, the spiritualist, and the folksy that kind of define the radical fashion scene in Hungary. So the first one, harcos, or it means warrior in Hungarian, is in many ways the most similar to the international extremist brands. Its aesthetics resonates especially with the more explicit labels, like Ansgar Arjan that you just saw on the previous slide. Though I think the themes highlighted by the design are, again, unequivocally Hungarian. So, the Greater Hungary theme that you can see there, for instance. So the production is also more local and small scale. It's a kind of boutique brand that doesn't have its own stores. It is sold online and through mobile vendors at rock concerts and festivals, and is carried by small retailers. Nevertheless, Harcos is the most widely known and disseminated radical nationalist clothing brand, embraced by many of the national rock bands, like Romantic Violence, so like the photo that was the image that's on the flyer that shows this national rock band, and they wearing this brand. Let me just see here again. So the man behind the brand, and that's him with his family, is Csaba Kiss, and he's originally a car mechanic from a small town in northeastern Hungary, an area that actually has a very strong support base for Jobbik, the radical right-wing party. And he started designing and printing T-shirts under this label in 2004. He notes that he created the clothing line to assist those who are willing to openly display their patriotism. He was also trying to persuade Hungarian radical nationalist youth, including previous skinheads, who favored global brands like Lonsdale, to switch to Hungarian labels. So he first actually printed his clothing label in English as Warrior, which he gradually swapped for the Hungarian equivalent. And then also coming up with pieces on which the label is printed in runic characters. He finds it particularly important, and again, I think you can see them, right? So there. He finds it particularly important to incorporate runes into his designs because he believes that the usage of runes practically marks out the radical nationalist camp. Since 2009, each garment produced under the label includes the following warning, which really clearly proclaims the political message of the brand. So this says that Warrior is not only a fashion label, and I'm quoting from the warning label itself, which, as you can see, is very long. I'm not going to read the whole thing, just the most important parts of the message here. So warrior is not only a fashion label, it's much more than that. It's a weapon against the system that is governed by the most harmful ideology ever, that of liberalism. We who wear harcos apparel are fighting for a country in which the national interests of Hungary triumph above all. I recommend my clothing line, The Radical Patriots Wear, to everyone with no age limit, but only to those who identify with the above values. And so this guy is also, and often, you know, he uses his family to kind of act as mannequins for for the T-shirts and the other apparel, and he tried himself in politics. He ran on the Jobbik, the Radical Party's ticket, and he was elected into the local government in 2010, but he was so disgruntled with professional politics that he gave up his seat after a year. So he decided kind of that this is a more effective vehicle to communicate his message than professional and kind of traditional politics. The second brand represents a very different take on radical nationalist fashion. Creators of the brand also stress the importance of employing runic script as part of the design and locally produced garments, but favor an aesthetic that highlights the spiritualist strain of radical nationalism. Their website is bilingual, printed both in Hungarian and runic script, which is again included in their logo as well. There is extensive explanation offered on the origins and symbolic meanings behind the name of the brand. That sounds like a real word, but actually it's invented. It doesn't really mean anything, but it uses kind of a root, ser, or the word is used in some parts of Transylvania. It's very archaic, but it uses a very important kind of root, ser, which is part of some of the most important and ancient Hungarian words, including love, method, structure, organization, ritual, and so on. And they argue that the name was picked to elicit the idea of community and unity and call for a new alliance that unites all Hungarians in synthesis with tradition. Szervető, the brand, that stands for the dissemination of this idea of solidarity in the Carpathian Basin. So the clothing line mixes the pan-Hungarian theme with strong Eastern mysticism, especially Central Asian shamanism, which is clearly reflected in the T-shirt designs. So the Scythian warrior, you cannot see it so well, but this is the image. So there is this Scythian warrior riding on a horse while shooting backward with an arch, or the image of the miraculous deer. These are fundamental motifs of this mythical vocabulary supplied by popular legends and nomadic tribes, including the Huns, the Avars, the Scythians, and the Hungarians, that were believed to have come into contact that Hungarians were believed to have come into contact with during the long migratory journey from Central Asia. But this company is a small family-owned firm. It has been active in the garment business for the past 20 years by making everyday wear, primarily T-shirts. The owner notes that they launched the brand because they did not understand, and I quote him, why everyone should wear T-shirts that say, "I love New York," or applesauce in Chinese characters. We were really annoyed by the fact that as young adults, we could not find everyday wear that was Hungarian, unique, and carried a meaningful message, while it was also affordable and comfortable. They also emphasized that the symbolism of the brand demands that each product is Hungarian-made in every respect, in design, manufacturing, and distribution. The T-shirts are silk-printed and embroidered in a small artisanal shop, and one of their signature designs, the Sun Worshipper, takes 10 hours and 60,000 stitches to make. So finally, the last brand exemplifies yet another variation on using fashion design to assert Hungarian cultural uniqueness and superiority. The symbolism of the brand owes its origins both to Hungarian folk traditions as well as the visual and material culture of the time of the Hungarian conquest of the Carpathian Basin between the 9th and 11th centuries, often referred to in Hungary as the Arpad Age, after the name of the dynasty that ruled the country in this period. There is, of course, nothing inherently nationalistic about embracing the aesthetics of this period. But radical nationalists uphold the material culture of the times of the conquest as evidence of the cultural superiority of Hungarian settlers over other ethnic groups like the Slavs who lived in the Carpathian Basin. As the history of this era can only be reconstructed from archaeological sources, there is chiefly material artifacts, there is plenty of room for interpretation that has spawned speculative and totally unsubstantiated theories about the kinship between Hungarians and various Near Eastern and Asian cultures like the Scythians and the Sumerians. These theories emerged roughly in the late 19th century and have, as you can see, have prevailed ever since, constituting a linchpin of the radical nationalist cultural canon. So the designer of the OCAD brand, that's the name of the brand, seems to share these views, as the brand's website contains a lengthy essay that openly endorses these ideas. So according to the main argument put forward by this interpretation, the material artifacts that have been dug up from this period are more intricate and sophisticated than it could be expected based on Hungarian status as a nomadic tribe at the time. Moreover, continues the reasoning, the material remnants of the period suggest that, and I quote, the technological civilizational development of Hungarian settlers can be considered to be almost on par with that of 20th century societies. So again, I think the message is that if you buy into this brand, you're buying into this message as well, this kind of ideology as well, right? And it's very, very prominent. So you kind of identify, by buying these pieces of clothing, you kind of identify by this political and cultural stance as well. But actually, the designer, Zsuzsanna Takács, who named the brand after herself, like it uses her last name, she actually has some even more direct links to the radical nationalist milieu. She designed the uniform of the Hungarian National Guard, the paramilitary wing of Jobbik. This is like the most notorious paramilitary right-wing group in Hungary, and it was actually banned by the courts in 2009. And she has been the long-time partner of the journalist András Bencsik, who is a central figure of Hungarian right-wing media and the owner of one of the main radical nationalist bookstore chains. So, it's a very kind of interlinked system. And I think it's interesting. She launched a brand, and she has a very prestigious degree from the Moholy Nagy University of Art and Design, and that was previously called the University of Applied Arts. And so she has like very serious formal training, and she launched a brand in 2008. The other two brands also came to life during the first decade of the 21st century, which is not coincidental, but I think shows that the percolation and crystallization of these sentiments began shortly after the turn of the millennium. So I know this is a lot of material, so let me just kind of conclude with a few points. So I try to argue that I think that the recent rise of radical nationalism has benefited from the vigorous commodification of radical nationalist sentiments. And I think, it really shows that the market is a very important conduit for the dissemination of radical nationalist ideas, and commercialization actually somehow facilitates the mainstreaming, because these objects become kind of props of everyday life, and they kind of domesticate these ideas, right? They seem unthreatening. And this is how they kind of bring this radical right-wing discourse more into the mainstream, and they increase the visibility, the everyday visibility of these ideas as well. And as I mentioned, these are not kind of independent, coincidental examples, but you can see it's kind of an interlinked system of signs and symbols. So the singers and the musicians in the radical nationalist bands, they wear the T-shirts and they buy the books, and the owner of the Bookstores chain is the partner of the designer. So this is a very closely knit network of people who both know each other and who intensify I think the cultural power of this radical nationalist consumer culture. And I think, I would also argue that while we see, Hungary is a very low-wage country where people do not spend so much on fashion and not even on books. So I think that the fact that we see these cultural niche economies, I think it shows that there is a strong middle-class base for this, right? So it's again this idea that right-wing populism, right-wing radicalism in Europe is really just a thing of the lumpen proletariat. I think, again, the fact that we have this vigorous cultural industry and this cultural niche markets, I think it shows that it does have a strong middle class base. So I think I just stop there and let you ask some questions. So thanks for your attention.
I flatter myself to think I know a little bit about the history and development of all of the European countries, or put another way, I have an equal and in-depth ignorance of all of them. Based on what I know about Hungary, I think I would, if I had to predict which country would be the most hostile to refugees, it probably would be Hungary, based on what happened after the Compromise of 1867, the treatment of minorities, a historically high rate of anti-Semitism, which people seem to be willing to admit in public opinion polls. I think I saw something in the New York Times which said 29% of Hungarians admit that they're anti-Semitic in public opinion polls, which is much higher. Just what, do you have any comment? Does that seem to make sense to you? Or?
So you think this is just kind of consistent with this story is
consistent with Hungarian history.
Yeah, in some ways it is. In other ways, I think the story is a little bit more complicated. I think the story is more complicated with refugees as well. And I think, you see all of Europe turning on this issue. But I think that what we see, and I think even national identity, if we think about a lot of these ideas were also compatible with the very Republican civic definition of national identity from the late 19th century, right? And somehow there they were seen as progressive because they were anti-monarchic, they were against the monarchy. So, I think there is more of a flexibility. They can be coupled with different ideologies. I mean, I don't see Hungarian history as static as you suggest, but yeah, I don't know who is next. Yeah, I didn't see the order of hands, but yeah.
Well, first of all, I wanted to say that I'm your fan, and I know your work, and the students in my cyberspace course read your paper on flash mobs.
Yeah,
So
it's a very different project.
yeah, this is really very different. So I'm interested in the economic market. Now, Hungary is a country of 10 million people, roughly, the same as Belarus, where I come from. So these books, kind of similar books in Belarus, are published with European crowds, which are donated for the development of democracy, etc., and they suppress national identity and whatever by the president. So, but it looks like in Hungary they are published published and sold at a market price. So, do they find the market? Is it possible to make it economically sustainable? Does it have an economic sense to publish this book?
Right. I mean, unfortunately, I don't have exact statistical figures on this, right? So part of what I'm saying is a little bit speculative, but you do have publishers. These are small independent publishers that specialize in printing this literature. And then you have these bookstores that I mentioned, and they have been around for a long time. So at some level, they have to be economically viable. Well, I would say that before 2010, I'm pretty certain that they were not receiving any EU subsidies in any form. Now this might be changing, but again, this is still further out to the right culturally and politically than even the ruling government of Fidesz, right? So this is, and again, I'm not suggesting that this is all there is in Hungary. And I mean, I'm not even suggesting that these are kind of the dominant culture forms or style. I'm talking about this as a kind of radical subculture. I'm not saying that this is the dominant culture standing in Hungary. But going back to, so I think that they have to be economically viable and sustainable, because otherwise you would not see these bookstores. And there are different strategies, I think. I think with Anima, the one that I showed you with the magazine stand. So I think there are strategies that they cross-finance. So they do not only do the radical nationalist literature, they also do more mainstream stuff. So I think they kind of cross-finance the radical nationalist stuff by also printing and selling mainstream literature. But then others, but they are the ones mainstreaming. But then at the very far end out there, you also have some explicitly neo-Nazi publishers publishers. They usually sell online. But I think here the interesting thing is that the neo-Nazi subculture, that's a global subculture. So if you look at their books, it's all translations, Hungarian translations of kind of international work. So I think there are different strategies, but my guess is that they have to be economically viable because they have been around for a long time. And as I said, I didn't talk about that, but one of them, the Pushki Publishing House, that has a 70-year-long history. So I'm sure that this business is running. I'm not sure how much profit they are making, but yeah.
Well, thank you. This was eerily familiar to me, which is depressing, because if you think about Turkey or, usually countries, I think that are in the periphery of the capitalist, penetration, you do see similar things.
Yeah.
What interests me in particular is the politics of cultural selectivity. I mean, especially with respect to the past. And it's similar to Turkey in the sense that there is the issue of script. I mean, obviously, what was interesting to me was the use of a script that's not Latin.
Like the runic, the runes.
And I wonder if people actually read that, or is it like there for symbolic reasons? So that's one question. I mean, how many people can actually read the script that is posed, let's say, as an alternative to the Latin script? And the other question I had was, they of course cherry-pick the past, and it looks like 9th, 10th century is one. I mean, what are the sort of, if you do an eventful analysis, what are the turning points they pick up, and is there a certain, way in which they categorize, prioritize certain events over other events?
Sure. Yeah, so I think these points are very important, and maybe just to your first point, I should add that, right, I mean, there is a very strong anti-globalization streak here, right? This is another issue, I think, that probably connects these kind of peripheral subcultures as well, right? So you can see that also the local production, local distribution, that's a very important element, but also in like the motives and the vocabulary. This anti-capitalist, anti-globalization element is very strong as well. And then in terms of like the different historical periods they pick up, I think that's also very informative because, as you can see, it's not so much the interwar period. Some symbols, like there is a particular flag, it's a red and white called the Arpad flag that was used by this Nazi party in the 1930s. So it is, but it's not as prominent as it could be or as much people think it is prominent. The 9th, 10th centuries, so the time of what we call the conquest, this is when like the Hungarian nomadic tribes kind of settled in where they are now in the Carpathian Basin. Well, that's a very, very prominent period, right? And then, interestingly, they also reappropriate. Then, of course, the national trauma of the Treaty of Trianon, right? So that's an interwar element, but it's not kind of the Nazi link, but it's the trauma of like losing 2/3 of your country. So the Greater Hungary theme is the most dominant from the interwar period. And then there is a little bit of the late 19th century. And here again, we have that, where even liberal and republican symbols are now being appropriated by the radical right. So, but I think those 3 periods are probably the most prominent. And the runic script, I cannot read it, but a lot of people, and that already kind of, it's a very Bourdieusian thing, the signifier signifies the signifier. So that already places me politically as well. But a lot of people, there's been this huge upsurge in both using and learning runic script. And now even like if you go to village, I was really struck, like last summer I had to travel a lot in the Hungarian countryside. And now if you travel like bus or by train, you see the names of the villages and the small towns. It's written in Hungarian, but also in runic script. And I heard that there is an entrepreneur, who really kind of convinced the local government to let him do this. So it's becoming very, very prominent, especially in the countryside. And again, just the very learning it is a big statement. And this is one of the defining. It's a very clear. If you see the runic script, you know what kind of people you are up to. So it's a very clear signifier of this subculture. Yeah. Yeah, I think there are probably examples for both direction, but I would again caution against a very strong and direct link here between this subculture and political parties, right? It's much more diffuse. I mean, some of, again, as I pointed out, right, you can find moments when there is a direct political link and people have been involved with the party, or, you know, these rock bands would play at the different events of Jobbik, but they are not sponsored by them, right? And they might be supporting Jobbik, but these are not like, so these are economically viable businesses, but they are not making a huge profit, right? These are smaller businesses. I think so their self-sustenance is the most important, but I'm sure that there could be then whatever little bit is left over, they might support Jobbik. But I think, you know, they're getting support from other sources. So I think there is probably a little bit of a back and forth, but I wouldn't say that this is making these businesses economically viable. That's certainly not the case. It's true that, you know, that they kind of, they make each other viable in the sense that the guy who produces the Warrior brand, he sponsors the rock bands, but then in turn they have to wear his brand as opposed to other brands. So it's kind of an interlinked system. But in each case, you know, it's more important. So the cultural importance of putting out these signs is more important than the business being profitable. So I think, again, I don't know so much about this case of the entrepreneur who put out the village signs, but for him, it's not because of profit, right? It's a cultural statement. So I think that is more important than.
I suppose my question was less about the profitability, but more about if there's any evidence to show that this exposure seems to be making popularizing these political sentiments, or not political sentiments, but cultural sentiments.
Now, the cultural sentiment, yes, definitely, right? But again, it's not necessarily linked to the political, to Jobbik, the radical right-wing party, right? But yeah, this is an important part of the argument, right? That by putting these signs into public discourse and increasing their public visibility, they become more accepted. And I have to say this, that even a few years back when I went back to Hungary and I saw, you know, this Greater Hungary car stickers are very popular. So instead of just like the general standard Hungary car sticker that you put on your car, now you see this Greater Hungary. So it shows Greater Hungary and then it has the H, right? And like a few years ago, I was totally shocked to see that because, again, in addition to the runes, like the Greater Hungary symbol is like a very clearly irredentist symbol. But by now, I mean, everybody has gotten used to it. And so I no longer bat an eyelid over seeing these Greater Hungary car stickers. So I think this is how, you know, it kind of, that this subculture, this consumer culture helps to shift the boundaries between the radical and the mainstream.
I just want to jump in on for tying those two statements together. This is just so fascinating. It's just so rich. But I've talked to you about this a little bit before, but in terms of the actual aesthetics and the periods and how those are linked to like video games, the popularity of Game of Thrones, just sort of how in general it's cool to be medieval, right? It's cool to be a warrior on horseback in a sort of more global aesthetic, and how that gets picked up. So in a way, in the ways that people might wear this stuff without really necessarily endorsing. So I know young people who think this stuff is cool even though they're not necessarily endorsing this far-right party. So just thinking about the linkages between the certain aesthetics and a broader, why is it that this aesthetic is so popular globally now?
Yeah, I'm not sure I can answer that question, but I think this is again exactly, so there is constant intersection, right, between the extreme and the mainstream, and this also adds to the viability of this subculture, right? And that's true for like the earlier right-wing extremist brands as well, I think like Lonsdale and so on, right? Because some people just bought it because they liked it, right? but that also helps to blur the boundaries between the mainstream and the extreme. At the same time, if you know, right, if you have the cultural capital, you know, I mean, I would never buy Lonsdale, or even though, like, you know, I like some of the T-shirts, but like I know what they mean, or you know, what is kind of the set of ideas that they are associated with. So I would never buy them. And if I see somebody wearing this stuff, I would make all sorts of assumptions about their political allegiances. And that's very Hungarian, right? Everything is very politicized, right? Even like which cafe you go to and where you buy your confectionaries. If you know, like, there was this family that goes, you know, for 5 generations they operated this patisserie, but they voted for the Nazis in the 1930s. So if your liberal friends see you there, you're in trouble. But so like a lot of culture is very politicized, right? Again, not in a kind of party politics way, but in the broader sense of the word. But I think this is one strategy. And I think we think about like right-wing extremism, radicalism as something far out there, right? Something that's kind of cut off, that's really well bounded. There is a sharp boundary between them and the rest of us. But I think if we look at like more the cultural aspects, we see that no, actually there are a lot of intersections, and there is a much more gradated way. The spectrum and the boundaries are much more blurred. Yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah, I could do that. I mean, I have to say that it's not so easy to do this type of research. I mean, this is a subculture, and you know, I'm just going to refute myself, but like this subculture is not so easily accessible for research. Okay, so I mean, I cannot send an email to this guy, to Chabakish, who created the Warrior brand, and say, you know, I'm from the New School, I'd like to do an interview with you, or do some type of ethnography. So it's very piecemeal to collect the data, but I mean, yeah, it would be very nice for me to be able to map the field. And I actually do that a little bit in another paper that's on civil society. That's how I got into this. So I have a paper on radical nationalist civil society in Hungary, because I was arguing that, you know, it's not just the political party. We have to look at like this much broader political participation beyond just political parties. And in Hungary, you find all these civic organizations. There are civic organizations, but they're promoting an illiberal agenda. So I try to map that field. And this is how I came into contact with the consumer culture as well. So, and especially for the civil society, I'm really trying to do the links. So I'm trying to do some kind of network analysis. So that's more moving into a field analysis type of research. Yeah. But certainly, you know, that would be very nice if I could do it.
Just to comment on that,
Mhm.
but the issue is, I mean, I think what you're doing that's sort of different from Bourdieu, in a way is, you know, he, I think, privileges the public over the private to a certain degree in the way he sort of, you know, he attaches meaning to action. Whereas in your case, I mean, I think by bringing in the whole issue of consumption, food consumption, you know, or consumption of brands and everything, I mean, you seem to bring in the personal much more. So that, you know, it depends on, you know, how is it that you personally would then construct the boundaries of the field, as opposed to Bourdieu, which is, of course, an interesting question.
Right, and maybe I would add to that, and that these are not so much about class identities, right? Even with the consumption, but like interestingly, it's more about like different types of collective political identities and group identities, where commodities are being used as kind of means of symbolic communication, right? They are kind of important markers of group boundaries and of political convictions. Yeah.
shocking thing to me when I was in Greece was that, like, this was actual dialogue, was they think they might get Constantinople back, but that was only very much in the very oldest part of the generation, whereas anybody, I would say, 50 and younger that I talked to didn't even care to, it wasn't even worth the thought. So I was wondering, is this sort of greater Hungary theme and this stuff specifically aimed at an age group?
So I think actually the Greater Hungary is the least linked to generations, I think, but different generations would use it in different forms, right? At the same time, I think this is much more for younger generations. And simultaneously, this is why I'm only building partly on subculture theories of youth cultures, because it's not only youth, right? So it actually, and it's not only men, it's not only masculine, as you can see, with, this guy with his family, and then also like in these images, the little kid, the children, the women. So it certainly cuts across gender lines. It cuts across age and class lines as well. But it's more like a middle age, from youth to late middle age. That's what I would say. And then older generations who are far out on the right, they would embrace some of the symbols, especially the Greater Hungary, like in forms of car stickers. But I think again, what's important here is there is a very large kind of younger generations that embrace this. But it's also linked, I think, to the anti-globalization and anti-capitalist message that's in a lot of this stuff. Yeah. But maybe just one other thing. I think actually I was thinking about it would be nice to do a comparison among these countries that all have, this nostalgia around like a greater version of themselves. I think like Turkey but even Austria. Well, I think they actually, I don't know how much, I was thinking about that. I don't know to what extent they do, but also, former Soviet Union, like Greece. So, it would be interesting to see how they deal with the former greater version of themselves, and how this theme comes back in kind of the right-wing populist discourse of the contemporary period. Yeah, if there is nothing else.
Well, we can talk to her informally after this. But thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks so much. Great questions. Yeah.